Welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at one of the most commonly encountered vehicles in the modern games, the BMP-2. A bit of the history behind it, its technical details as modelled in Combat Mission, its different variants, what they do and how to identify them, and then the tricky part, how to get the most out of it in-game. The BMP is rooted in the Cold War environment of the 1950s, where both NATO and the Soviet Union were expecting to use tactical nuclear weapons. This threat had two important consequences. Firstly, units needed to be fast-moving and well-dispersed to avoid presenting easy targets for nuclear weapons. Speed and mobility were key. Second, the resulting battlefield was likely to be heavily contaminated by nuclear fallout. While infantry would always be necessary, their survival in this kind of environment was questionable. The solution to both of these questions was to fully mechanize the Soviet army. Rifle infantry would become motor rifle infantry, traveling in and fighting from armored vehicles that provided the speed and protection necessary for infantry to function on the nuclear battlefield. This created a design requirement that ultimately spawned two vehicles: the cheaper wheeled BTR and the more expensive tracked BMP. In many respects, the BMP was a revolutionary vehicle. Armed with a 73mm low-velocity gun and 83 ATGMs, it had a formidable anti-tank capability, whilst being able to transport 9 men who could fight from inside the vehicle using a series of firing ports. But it was also a product of its time. Designed in the first half of the 1960s, the BMP was expected to fight on a battlefield with a very different anti-tank threat than we think of today. In particular, the anti-tank capability of enemy infantry, equipped with either light, short-range weapons or recoilless rifles analogous to World War II anti-tank guns, was not only limited, but anticipated to be severely curtailed by the contaminated environment. As such, the BMP was designed to withstand heavy machine gun fire from the front and not much else. The light armour also helping retain mobility and, always a key Soviet requirement, ensuring the vehicle was amphibious. As the Cold War ground on and both sides reached the nuclear parity that would restrict the use of nuclear weapons for fear of retaliation in kind, conventional warfare drifted back onto the menu. This, combined with developments in infantry anti-tank weapons, particularly early ATGMs, put the BMP-1 in an awkward position. The 73mm main gun was not an effective weapon at suppressing or destroying enemy infantry, and the combination of low velocity and large fins on the projectiles made it inaccurate past 300 meters. With Soviet Doctrine adjusting to the new anti-tank environment by pushing BMPs further back behind the tanks in their formations in order to keep them safe, the short effective range of the 73mm gun was now a serious problem. Combat experience in the 1973 Yom Kippur War highlighted this, as well as many of the BMP-1's other shortcomings, and led to the development of the BMP-2. Entering service in the early 1980s, the BMP-2's most obvious improvement over its predecessor was a change in main armament. The 73mm low-velocity gun was replaced with a stabilized 30mm high-velocity autocannon in an enlarged two-man turret. Other improvements included slightly enhanced armour protection, courtesy of a new alloy rather than a redesign, and a more powerful engine to take into account all the extra weight. Up to 26,000 vehicles were made between the Soviet Union, its satellite states, and other licensed manufacturers. It's seen combat service around the world and spawned a wealth of variants. But despite this, the BMP-2 still suffered from some fundamental design problems. It was still poorly protected, even to the point that new explosive reactive armour packages were too dangerous to mount. The interior was still cramped, a particular problem even in the new turret, where space to cram in new equipment and optics was severely limited. This was apparently obvious to the Soviets, as evidenced by development of the BMP-3 in the very late stages of the Cold War, but the collapse of the Soviet Union plunged the now Russian army and the military-industrial complex supporting it into a pit which it has struggled to climb out of. Whether the BMP-3 was intended to fully replace the BMP-2 is hard to tell, but the black hole of the 1990s effectively made that impossible, and the BMP-2 remains in service with the Russian army in vast numbers to this day. There have been attempts to modernize and upgrade the design, primarily for the export market, but the vast majority of BMP-2s remain unmodified. So how does this all translate into combat mission? I'm going to be using Combat Mission Black Sea for this, but most of what I'm going to cover is also going to be relevant to the BMP-2 in Combat Mission Cold War and Combat Mission Shock Force 2. In terms of mobility, we can wheel out the vehicle mobility test again, in which the BMP-2 scored 499 points. This is very comparable to the Bradley at 498, and sits in between the more powerful BMP-3's 448 and the wheeled BTR-82's 542. Notably, but anecdotally, because it's not a big enough sample size really, the BMP-2 only bogged twice in the ground test, which would make sense because tracks and a light weight of about 14 tons should translate into a lower ground pressure. It's also amphibious, though like all amphibious vehicles in CM, it's slow in the water and you really don't want to be crossing any water obstacles under fire. Moving on to firepower, the BMP-2's main armament is the 30mm 2A42 cannon. Firing APDS, this can penetrate the frontal armour of the Bradley inside 750 metres if it gets lucky. Lighter vehicles like Strikers and Humvees are fair game, while tanks like the Abrams are pretty much non-penetrable but susceptible to potentially crippling subsystem damage. The high explosive incendiary round is effective when on target, but it's worth bearing in mind that the shells have a high velocity and a resultant long, thin beaten zone, so engaging enemy infantry in the open at range might not be as effective as you would expect. Shooting up taller targets capable of intercepting more incoming rounds, things like buildings and to a lesser degree foliage, is much more effective. The cannon has a dual feed, so it can easily swap between ammunition types. In combat mission it's loaded with 160 rounds of APDS and 340 rounds of HEI. Mounted coaxially with the cannon, we have a PKT machine gun. This is pretty standard for Soviet vehicles. The entire weapon out is stabilised, so it's possible to engage with the cannon and the coax on the move. The BMP-2 is also armed with an 85 ATGM. This is mounted on top of the turret and can fire a missile out to 4,000 metres using wire-guided SACLOS. This means it can't be fired on the move, and the vehicle has to remain stationary rather than guide the missile to the target. The warhead is single-stage heat, so it will be defeated by explosive reactive armour, but if it can find a gap or an engaged target without ERA, it's entirely capable of knocking out other IFVs and posing a non-negligible threat to tanks. The BMP-2 carries 4 AT-5s in total, and despite being mounted on the roof, the missiles can be reloaded under cover. This is a respectable amount of firepower, especially for the time it was developed, but exploiting it can be difficult thanks to the BMP-2's optics, which we'll get to in a little bit. In terms of protection, the BMP-2 is proof against 50 caliber machine gun fire from the front, thanks in great extent to the extremely shallow angle of the nose and the ridges mounted on it, but that's about it. 50 caliber fire from outside that frontal arc will punch straight through the side or rear armour. Anything larger will just ignore it, and even the smallest heat warheads such as those on 40mm HEDP grenades will poke holes no problem. With regards to post-penetration effects, there is little extra protection for the crew or passengers, and while it's not as susceptible to catastrophic detonations as the BMP-3, the fact that it is easily penetrated means that its onboard ammunition and fuel are likely to burn or cook up. Finishing off the technical characteristics with a digital walkaround, we're going to start with the rear section of the hull. This is where most of the BMP's dismounts live. They enter and exit via 2 rear doors with space for 6 passengers behind the turret sitting back to back. Each rear door has a periscope and a firing port for the passenger's individual weapon. There are 3 more periscopes and firing ports on each side of the hull, 1 for each position. These allow the passengers to fight from inside the vehicle, which is a significant capability on a nuclear battlefield where dismounting is hazardous for your health. In practical terms, it's difficult to actually spot targets through the narrow periscopes, never mind actually hit them at anything greater than point-blank range, especially if the vehicle is moving, but it's a non-trivial capability. Not an issue in combat mission, but the rear compartment is very cramped when all 6 seats are taken. There's not a lot of room back there, a problem which is exacerbated by the back-to-back arrangement and the low overall height of the vehicle. It's very common for BMP passengers to avoid travelling inside the vehicle, not just as a protective measure, but because the ergonomics are just that bad. While we're here, as an infantry fighting vehicle, the BMP-2 does carry extra ammunition for its dismounts. In combat mission, this load amounts to 5 PG-7VL rockets for the RPG-7, 4 RPG-26 one-shot disposable light anti-tank weapons, over 1,000 rounds of 7.62 by 54mm R, and over 2,000 rounds of 5.45mm. Also worth noting here is that the bulges in the rear door are fuel tanks, which go along with another fuel tank between the side-facing seats. These are features that have contributed to the BMP's reputation as a fire trap, but that's perhaps a little overblown. Fuel is surprisingly good at absorbing incoming rounds, and is a lot harder to set on fire than you might expect. So the fuel tanks in the doors actually serve to increase the BMP-2's rear protection, provided they've been filled, and to be honest, the fire risk presented by the centrally mounted fuel tank between the seats is probably less of a concern than the fact that any enemy rounds actually reaching it are going to have hit something much more important along the way. There are 2 more fuel tanks as well. The BMP-2 has a significant emphasis on range. On a full tank it can drive for about 600 kilometers without having to refuel. Again, this is a reaction to that nuclear battlefield. The longer vehicles can operate on a single fuel load, the less often they have to concentrate with refueling assets and present a target. On the rear deck we have 2 more hatches. These don't work in combat mission, but in reality they're useful for air guards and getting out if the rear doors are blocked or inoperative. Coming round to the front deck, we have a swimming deflector in the stow position, then this shallow front slope covered in ridges. The ridges serve sort of like spaced armour to degrade heavy machine gun rounds skipping over the front slope. Past this we have a pretty conventional IFV layout. The engine is on the right side of the vehicle, given away by the big grills. On the left we have 2 hatches. The forward hatch is the driver's position. He's got 3 periscopes to see in his front arc, then 1 covering his left. The central front scope can be swapped out for some night vision equipment, but we'll get onto the BMP-2's night fighting capabilities in a moment. There are some notable shortcomings here. The flat nose of the BMP means that the driver has a pretty substantial blind spot to his front, and being located on the left side of the vehicle, he would have a poor view to his right even if he actually did have a periscope that looked in that direction. It's worth noting that these aren't problems restricted to the BMP, they're pretty common byproducts of having the engine and the driver side by side up front. Behind the driver's position, we have the old commander's position. This is where the vehicle/squad commander sits in the BMP-1, and some of the reasons why they moved that position in the BMP-2 should be obvious. Sat right behind the driver, the commander had a very poor view, not just because he's got all the same visibility problems as the driver, but because the BMP is a very low-slung vehicle. The hull is only about the height of a man, so positions there have no significant elevation. This was clearly suboptimal, so in the BMP-2 the commander's position has been moved from here to a better position in the new enlarged turret. The space is still left over though, so there is a 7th passenger seat up front behind the driver. This is accessible internally by a narrow corridor that runs between the side of the hull and the turret basket, but that's something of a last resort, and access is usually via the hatch on top. Suffice to say, it's not a great position. It's only got 2 periscopes covering front and front left, so you can't see a lot. Moving on to the turret, we obviously have the weaponry we covered earlier, the 30mm cannon, the coax and the ATGM. On the BMP-2's left we have the gunner position. The gunner's primary sight is the forward-looking optic. This is a combined day-night sight for the cannon and coax. Supplementing that, there are 3 viewing prisms around the gunner's hatch, covering front right, front left and left, plus an additional prism mounted in the hatch itself that allows the gunner to see to his rear via some mirrors. Finally, for the gunner, the AT-5 ATGM has its own optics. These run from a position underneath the launcher to a sighting assembly separate to the gunner's primary sight. In other words, the gunner can't launch and guide the AT-5 through the same sight he uses to fire the cannon and the coax. He has to physically switch to a different eyepiece inside the turret, which has all kinds of problems from a spotting and target acquisition perspective. Next to the gunner in the turret we have the new commander's position. From up here, he has a much better view than he did down in the hull of the BMP-1. He has a similar array of periscopes to the gunner, covering front left, front right and rear, but the commander's periscopes are all mounted in the hatch itself and can freely rotate, so it's not as restricted as it looks. Both of the turret hatches open forwards, giving the crew some extra protection against small arms fire if they're opened up. On top of the commander's hatch, we have an IR spotlight. This rotates through the hatch and gives the commander his own source of IR illumination. The gunner has his own spotlight attached to the cannon mount. All three crew stations have night vision capability, but these spotlights give away the fact that this relies primarily on active IR illumination. Turning on the spotlights allows you to see in the dark, but immediately gives your position away to anyone with an optic that can see infrared. That was less of a problem in the early 80s. These days, passive night vision equipment is very common, especially amongst the BMP-2's Western competition, so actually using the active IR is a bad idea. As usual with night vision equipment, it's difficult to be certain exactly what's going on in combat mission and how it's modelled, but in relative terms the BMP-2 is significantly outclassed by more modern NATO IFVs, especially those with thermal imagers. Finally, on the sides of the turret, we have a set of smoke launchers. In-game, these give the BMP-2 the ability to pop smoke twice in the classic Soviet offensive style, where the smoke grenades are launched about 100 meters ahead of the vehicle in order to create a smoke screen behind which the vehicle has room to maneuver. The downside is that the smoke takes some time to fully bloom, and it's not multispectral, so any opposition out there with thermal imagers will see right through it. It should be clear from going over the crew positions that one of the BMP-2's weaknesses is its situational awareness. This is a problem for all armoured vehicles, especially older designs, but the BMP-2 has a specific problem in how it's crewed. Doctrinally, for what that's worth, the BMP-2 is a core component of the motor rifle squad. The squad leader is in command of both the vehicle and the dismounts. This means that when the squad is mounted, he sits in the commander's position up in the turret, where he has the best view and can make use of the BMP's radios. When the squad kicks its dismounts out, the squad leader gets out and joins them. The BMP now has no one occupying the commander's position. That means that the coordination offered by a third man, who can provide the situational awareness the other crew members need to focus on their jobs, is gone. The commander can no longer assist the gunner in scanning for and identifying targets, he can no longer help the driver navigate, make best use of terrain, or avoid obstacles, including, now that they're doctrinally deployed on either side of the vehicle, friendly dismounts. In addition, the spotting potential of the vehicle is now not only reduced, but limited in certain directions. Remember, the driver and the gunner have a limited capacity to see to their right. Obviously, losing the vehicle commander when the squad dismounts is a serious problem, but again, we're dealing with a legacy doctrinal element on the nuclear battlefield, and in keeping with the kinds of high-tempo mobile operations favoured by the Soviets, dismounting is a last resort. The expected norm was to fight mounted, in which case this commander problem never manifests. That's a quick once-over of the BMP-2. In Combat Mission Black Sea there are two variants, the BMP-2K and the BMP-2M. The BMP-2K is the command vehicle variant. This is essentially a standard BMP-2 with extra radio equipment and a few very minor changes. It's easily identifiable by a second aerial mounted on the hull, and less easily identifiable by the deletion of some of the rear compartment firing ports. In Combat Mission Black Sea terms, the main difference is the BMP-2K's access to satellite PDA communications, principally the Russian Constellation 2M system. The BMP-2M, meanwhile, is a variant that attempts to drag the BMP-2 out of the 1980s and introduce some more modern AFV features. These modernizations are substantial, but limited to the turret, which has been upgraded to feature the Berezok combat module. Most obviously, the centrally mounted AT-5 has been removed and two dual AT-14 Cornet pods added to the turret sides. The AT-14 is a much more modern and capable missile than the old AT-5 and can reach out to 5,000 meters with a tandem heat warhead. In this configuration, each pod can fire both missiles in quick succession, the intent being for the second missile to penetrate any active protection systems mounted on the target in their reload reset period after intercepting the first missile. The missiles are sackless guided, riding a laser beam instead of trailing a control wire. In most respects this is a much superior guidance method, but the laser will trigger any laser warning systems mounted on the target. The BMP-2 carries no reloads, it goes into battle with all its missiles ready to go in the pods. The gunner has a new sighting complex in a doghouse in front of his hatch. This incorporates both night vision and thermal imaging channels, can exploit data from a new laser rangefinder, can be used to fire and guide the AT-14s, so the gunner doesn't have to swap optics when switching to the ATGMs, and is generally a massive step forward compared to the previous sight. Hand in hand with this, the active IR spotlights for both gunner and commander are no longer needed, so they've been deleted, but the gunner has lost all his supplementary forward-facing periscopes. He retains the rear-facing viewing prism, but this now appears to be pretty useless because its view is blocked by a new weapon mounted on the rear of the turret. This is an AGS-17 30mm automatic grenade launcher. It's a comparatively low-velocity, high-trajectory weapon compared to the 30mm cannon, which can chuck high explosive grenades out to a theoretical range of 1700 meters. As usual, it's probably significantly more effective closer in. The AGS-17 is fed from a 250 grenade belt that sits in an ammo can on the turret roof. There aren't any reloads carried. The commander's hatch hasn't seen any changes, but though the field of view of the hatch periscopes suffers from all the extra gubbins bolted to the turret roof, the commander has received his own independent thermal viewer. This is fixed to the back of the turret, next to the AGS-17 and behind the commander's position. It's another significant uptick in capability, assuming there is actually anybody sat in the commander's position to use it. Less visibly obvious, but featuring in the Combat Mission UI, the BMP-2M also incorporates the Constellation 2M system and has access to satellite communications. Finally, with the AT-14 pods fitted to the sides of the turret, the smoke launchers have had to move. They're now in 2 clusters of 3, one on each turret cheek. They work the same way as the standard BMP-2 launchers, except they now emit multispectral smoke that is opaque to thermal images. All the other elements of the BMP-2M remain unchanged. It's basically gotten a heavily upgraded turret that keeps in line with what seems to be a Russian fascination in attaching ever-increasing amounts of weapons to things. All these technical features basically boil down to 2 salient points when we start thinking about how to use the BMP-2 down at the tactical. In simple terms, it can't take a hit, and the standard variant can't see very much. These are problems accepted in the design, intended to be mitigated by Doctrine. Soviet Doctrine specifically keeps BMPs in the second or third line of attacking formations, 300 to 400 meters behind the tanks. When an attack goes in, pre-identified or suspected enemy positions are hammered with massed artillery, obscured by smoke, and engaged with direct fire. What defending anti-tank weapons are still in the fight will likely focus their attention on the more heavily protected tanks and not the vulnerable BMPs. That's the theory. The reality is that even under ideal circumstances, dispersion, suppression, and obscuration serve to fragment the battlefield into a series of smaller engagements that can leave the BMPs exposed. And the ever-increasing range, lethality, accuracy, and ease of use of modern anti-tank weapons means that the chances of small enemy infantry teams being able to take advantage of such exposure has ramped up. This is a serious problem for all armoured vehicles. It's an unbiased feature of the modern battlefield. But because the BMP-2 is so lightly armoured and cannot have that armour improved by applique countermeasures like ERA, it is definitely at the lower end of the survivability scale. In a similar vein, the BMP-2 is intended to be used en masse, with the vehicles operating in company and battalion strength to overcome the poor spotting potential of individual vehicles. Again, the reality of a fragmentary battlefield makes this a questionable assumption for any kind of armoured vehicle, but the BMP-2 comes from a set of design principles that exacerbates the problem. In theory, the BMP-2M's improvements should mitigate these spotting problems, but it's a very difficult element of combat mission to quantify, and, anecdotally, they certainly suffer from poor spotting capability relative to their US opposition in Black Sea. Outside of the old Cold War doctrinal use case for the BMP-2, there is also the Broner grouper, or armoured group concept. This developed through Soviet experience in Afghanistan. Here, motor rifle units were usually conducting operations where the doctrine intended for conventional warfare against NATO in Europe was just not applicable. Afghanistan didn't only require different tasks, convoy escort, sweep and clear actions, and ambushes, but these often took place in the mountains, in villages, and in the dense green zones, where it was difficult or impossible for the BMPs to remain in the close proximity to their dismounts as mandated by Doctrine. In this context, BMPs could act as battle taxis, getting their dismounts as far forward as they could under protection from small arms fire, and then work together in their platoons and companies in what was effectively a light tank role. Unshackled from their infantry, the BMPs could form a distant base of fire, maneuver to isolate enemy positions, or stand by as a mobile reserve. The BMP could certainly prove effective in that role, but the anti-tank threat environment of 1980s counterinsurgency Afghanistan is obviously an order of magnitude less than that of the modern conventional war we see in Combat Mission. The Broner Grouper concept might seem more sensible than the old Soviet doctrinal concepts, but it still suffers from a lot of the same problems. And the point, like I keep saying, is that these are generic armoured vehicle issues. There are a lot of very capable anti-tank weapons out there on the modern battlefield that present serious challenges to much more heavily armoured vehicles. Never mind IFVs with their roots firmly set in the 1960s. So to some extent, what I'm trying to say here is not so much that the BMP-2 is a bad vehicle, as it is that all vehicles in the same class face serious challenges. These challenges can be overcome by shaping the situation to increase the safe area of operation. The issue for the BMP is that as an older vehicle designed for a battlefield that never materialized, and having failed to keep up with developments in military technology, it requires a much greater safety margin than other vehicles. To put it another way, the BMP-2's survivability onion has some very thin layers. Mistakes will be punished, punishment will generally be fatal, and there is not an easy solution. So, that is a quick once-over of the BMP-2, which came out much longer than I was anticipating. Hope you all enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you have any thoughts on how to best use the BMP-2 series in Combat Mission, let everybody know in the comments. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.